Hello all. I just feel called to read a passage or section from my book, The Story of Jason Griffin. It's a particular scene that I was most excited to write, and I was like, I couldn't believe that I'd finally got around to actually doing it after having years of severe writer's block. So yeah, I'm just going to read this out, and I hope you enjoy it. So the chapter is called Flight and Encounter. The griffin's eyes lit up at that moment, and it jerked its head towards its lion's body. Jason peered around. Its long tail was twitching excitedly on the grass. Clearly the griffin was concocting something. Jason could see it in its expression, though it looked calm and impassive. It had a mischievous twinkle in both of its eyes, and if it did not have a beak instead of a mouth, he might have noticed the beast was slightly smiling. But realizing that he was being offered the opportunity of a lifetime, he thought, might as well, and climbed onto the griffin's back. It did not try to jerk him off, but instead lifted its wings so that Jason could have enough room to get on. It was very comfortable, but this did not stop Jason from feeling nervous about what was probably going to happen next. Slowly and steadily, the griffin's body rose. Jason gritted his teeth and hung on tightly to the griffin's neck. I'm not sure about this. As the image of himself falling through the sky came into his mind, he leaned forwards with his chest flat against the griffin's back and wrapped both of his whole arms around its neck, clasping its feathers even tighter so his knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the griffin took off. Jason closed his eyes. It was literally like being shot out of a cannon as they rose into the sky at an incredibly fast rate. Jason felt his stomach turn inside out. He had never experienced anything like this before. He wondered if he had maybe left a part of himself behind on the ground in the process of taking off so quickly, because for some reason he felt lighter. He could feel the force of the wind against his face, his hair being pushed back by the uplifting breeze. The horrible thing was that they were still climbing. Jason had to hold on for dear life as he and the griffin were flying vertically towards the clouds. His knees were locked in position on either side of the griffin's body, and his hands were still clinging onto the golden brown feathers located above its shoulder joints. When Jason sensed at last that they were flying level, he felt immensely relieved. About 5 seconds later, Jason opened his eyes slowly, but he could not bring himself to lift his stomach off the griffin's body or loosen his grip around its neck. They were about 1,000 feet in the air, and all he could see below him were vast patches of green, as well as a few scattered forests and hill ridges. It seemed that they were already miles away from Edinburgh. He could not see from this distance the towering cluster of buildings that made up the city, and a troubling thought occurred to him. What if it had been the last he had seen of his home? What if the griffin did not bring him back? He would be stuck out here, left alone in the great unknown Scottish countryside. His mother, his whole family in fact, would be wondering where he had gone. This is not good, thought Jason, and he prayed silently to himself, hoping the griffin was planning to return him to Carlton Hill. Moments later, the griffin's body lurched, and Jason saw the ground below tilt downwards, and he realised they were starting to climb upwards again. This time he kept his eyes open. They were ascending rapidly into veils of mist and on through a dense ocean of clouds, until eventually they broke free into a bursting landscape of sunlight. Afterwards it was like hovering inches above a fluffy, bubbly white mattress. the griffins slowed down so that they were soaring delicately through thin, cold wisps of air. It was a very strange feeling. For Jason, it was like he had just entered a completely different realm, where nobody else was around, and there was unlimited space and freedom to do whatever he wanted and just totally be himself. He felt like he could shout out to the heavens and not risk himself being heard or responded to. This place was like a magical, empty land, untainted, pure. Any stressful thoughts he'd had whilst on Earth were now gone from his head. He had no idea why he felt so calm, when, for all intents and purposes, he should have felt scared. It did not make sense at all. He was miles away from home, but even that did not concern him anymore. For the first time in his life since his foster parents' disappearance, he was immeasurably happy. His exuberance was not to last, however, for after a few minutes, the dense air around him started taking its toll on his breathing. Suddenly his lungs felt heavy and rather constricted by the lack of oxygen that was around him. "Do not panic," he said to himself, but of course, what else was there to do? Unless he could speak the griffin's language, he couldn't let the creature know he was dying, could he? Then, as if it had sensed Jason's thoughts about him being in trouble, the griffin started to descend lower beneath the clouds and white mist. It purposefully twisted itself into a dive, and Jason, whose fingers were numb from the cold atmosphere, had to hold on much tighter this time. The wind pushed against him, causing his body to lift off from the griffin's back into the air. He had to wrap both of his arms around the creature's neck in order to keep himself from falling off. He tried to shout "stop," but his voice was carried away by the wind. Thankfully, it was not long before they were flying level again. Swiftly the griffin carried Jason over a bunch of more hills, some of which, he noticed, were wooded. They were making their way past lakes and trees, reaching farmlands and soaring casually above a couple of small dotted villages. Jason looked around to see if he could spot Edinburgh anywhere, but he might as well have been searching for a needle in a haystack. So many different clusters of buildings around, he could not tell which was which. "Maybe I should have brought a map with me," he mused jokingly to himself. Everything looked remarkable from up here. The hills were so perfectly aligned with each other, and the forest seemed to be dotted in places that only complemented the rest of the scenery. They had been flying for what seemed like 20 minutes now, and already Jason was feeling tired with all the strain in his limbs from holding on. Second by second, his concern turned into mild panic as he realised that his knees and hands were gradually losing the strength to keep a firm grip on the griffin's body. At first he thought it was nothing, that it was impossible for him to slip because at that point his weight felt moderately balanced on top of the griffin. But the longer they flew, the more unbalanced he started to feel, and his muscles were beginning to tense up, which was not a good sign. He knew then that the chance of him not falling to his death was very slim. It was inevitable now. His body was starting to slip over the side, but he still held on to the griffin, his whole arms wrapped desperately around its neck. His right leg was dangling underneath the creature's belly, whilst his left was still draped over its back. All that time he was calling out to the griffin for help. He was not sure if it could hear him, or even understood what he was saying. Whichever it was, they were barely below 1,000 feet in the air. He was doomed. He started slapping the griffin's neck with the palm of his hand to get its attention, while shouting, "Land! Land! Go lower now! Please! I'm slipping!" Thankfully, the griffin seemed to get the message, because just then it gave a loud, distressful cry and started descending immediately, lower and lower until they were 100 feet above the ground. They flew right over a wood. Then, unable to hold on any more because of the speed at which they were accelerating, Jason's clasp around the griffin's feathers loosened dramatically, and he fell downwards into a group of trees below.